Rising from the Ashes, Sae-gu and the Formation of Korean American Identity. On April 29, 1992, 4 LAPD officers who were filmed beating up a black motorist named Rodney King the year before were acquitted, setting off protests in Los Angeles, California that remain today one of the largest uprisings in U.S. history. Violence erupted and was concentrated in south central Los Angeles and Koreatown, with rioting, looting, and fires. Over the course of 6 days, 54 people died, more than 2,300 were injured, more than 12,000 were arrested, and there were close to $1 billion in damages. This political protest-turned-riot represented a culmination of years of pent-up frustrations and anger due to institutionalized racism, economic hardship, and police brutality. Among riot victims, Koreans sustained the greatest losses. 2,280 Korean-owned businesses were destroyed, nearly every building in Koreatown was damaged, and close to $400 million in property damages were sustained. Many Korean business owners did not have insurance, meaning that years of hard work in America were burned in an instant. Tens of thousands of Koreans immediately lost their livelihoods. Korean-owned businesses were targeted in the riots due to racial tensions and cultural misunderstandings between the Korean and Black communities. South Central Los Angeles had a fairly established Black community when more Latinx and Korean people started to move in. An influx of immigrants began arriving in the U.S. from Asia and Latin America after the 1965 Hart-Celler Act was passed. Most Korean immigrants did not know about the multiracial society they were entering, nor the history of institutionalized racism in America. Their political education was influenced by the U.S., and many of them believed America was a haven where everyone had equal rights and opportunities for success. Journalist Helen Zia states that in their pursuit of the American dream, the new immigrants seemed oblivious to the African Americans' long history of struggle for their unfulfilled dreams. With the economic hardships in South Central, new arrivals had to compete for scarce housing, jobs, and economic opportunities. Due to language and cultural barriers, many Koreans turned to entrepreneurship to make a living. At the time of the riots, 1 in 3 Koreans in LA County operated a small business. There was a notion in the Black community that Korean store owners were rude and dismissive.
I'm not surprised that the Koreans got targeted because their prices are high, their attitude is wrong, and they just don't seem to have any respect for the Black community.
In the Korean community, there was an anxiety about robberies, assaults, and shootings. 13 days after the beating of Rodney King, Soon Ja-do, a Korean woman whose family owned Empire Liquor, was manning the store when she got into a physical altercation with Black teenager Latasha Harlins. Do accused Harlins of stealing, then shot Harlins in the back of the head, killing her and causing anger to rise towards the Korean community. Do got off with probation and a fine, never having to serve jail time. The media gave much attention to Black-Korean conflict, often showing the footage of the beating of Rodney King alongside the footage of Soon Ja-do shooting Latasha Harlins. The perpetuation of the narrative that Black-Korean relations were negative led journalist K.W. Lee to argue that this scapegoating was the real victimization that Korean Americans were made to suffer. We were told in a backhanded way that we were to blame for the riots and that we should rightly bear the burden. A common story told among Korean Americans in LA and elsewhere was that during the riots, the LAPD barricaded the roads surrounding Koreatown, protecting the richer neighborhoods and funneling the riots into Koreatown. Some Koreans called the police every 5 minutes with no response. Others had to wait hours for any sort of help. Rose Kim states that the police's abandonment of Korean store owners during the violent outbreak and the scapegoating of Korean immigrants as the source of Black rage conveyed the perception that Koreans were more expendable than the wealthy whites in Beverly Hills. Koreans did not have political clout nor capital. With no police protection, some store owners resorted to defending themselves. Armed with guns, some Koreans shot into the air and onto the ground to deter looters and protect their stores, and by extension, their livelihoods that they had worked so hard to establish. Korean immigrants saved up money to move to America, bought businesses to keep their livelihoods, and worked incredibly long hours just to achieve a semblance of economic stability. Then, in less than a week, everything turned to ashes.
Why are we the victims? I mean, my friends are precious. I mean, we've been through so much, and to go through this, I mean, everything, 22 years down the drain.
Some Koreans saw the events of Sae-gu as an extension of Han, the feeling of sorrow and anger due to accumulated experiences of oppression faced by Koreans. Koreatown represented a place for Koreans in America. Even to those not living in LA at the time, it was a space that provided a sense of cultural identity. In a survey conducted after the riots, most Koreans said they experienced symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder.
정말 이거는 미국이 아니라 이거는 정말 미친 나라예요. 한마디로 말해서 미친 나라, 미친 나라. 이게 무슨 미국입니까? 내가 어렸을 때 생각하고 생각했던 이상 그런 게 완전히 다 이게 뒤바뀌어진 거죠. 그렇기 때문에 이 미국에 대해서 뭐라 그러냐 막 이렇게 미국이 어떤 나라인가 와보고 싶었고 살고 싶었고 그런 꿈 같은 저희가 다 하나의 저기로 그냥 무너내리더라고요.
The destruction of Koreatown shattered the American dream of many Korean Americans and exemplified that Asian Americans as a whole held a precarious place in unequal American society. These events were a turning point in Korean American history. Koreans began identifying more as Korean American, and the Korean Federation changed its mission from aiding Koreans in the US to aiding Korean Americans. The 1.5 and second generation Korean Americans stepped into the light as political activists. There began to be more discussion about race relations and tensions outside of the black-white conflict. Korean Americans began to accept and become part of the multiracial and multicultural society they were living in. On May 2, 1992, many Korean Americans took to the streets to march for peace. They called for peace, justice for Rodney King, and an end to the system that led to and allowed the riots to destroy so much. They blamed political leaders in the LAPD for not protecting them. These marches served as a performance and as a way for Koreans to begin advocating for themselves. After the riots, there was more awareness of Korean identity and culture in the mainstream media. Los Angeles was rebuilt with a focus on interracial and interethnic collaboration, and there was an increased racial awareness between Black and Korean Angelenos. For the 25th anniversary after the riots, city officials and members of the African American and Korean communities came together to commemorate the riots and send a message of unity. Black-Korean relations have become better since 1992, but community members are still working towards mutual understanding and solidarity for the future.